Control copy. Hello, bros. We are back with the finale of Mars Without Venus, a study of some homosexual generals by Major General Frank M. Richardson. A book which probably shouldn't have been written because it's unpersuasive, to say the least. But here we are. So let me get this. Chapter 8. Save. And then we'll do this. Open the chat. Turn down the volume. Haroon. Haroon. Is it really just this bad of a... Or is my connection that terrible? Haroon. Is it really just this... Can't be bad of a... Or is my connection that terrible? Haroon. Is it really just this... Is it just really this bad? Shut up. All right. Apologia. In writing a book about well-known soldiers, one would hope to conform to the requirements of a well-known soldier and military writer. Major General J.F.C. Fuller, 1878 to 1966, said that writing a book could only be justified if it were provocative or approached the subject from a new angle. Boney Fuller must have been a very multi-angular writer, for he wrote no less than 28 books. In his day, a book about homosexuality might have been considered provocative, especially if it seemed in any way to condone that deviation, or at any rate to try to understand the victims of it. But today, scarcely a week passes without references to the subject, and reviews of books, films, and plays. I suspect that the only readers who may feel that they have the right to feel provoked are those whom one might call enthusiastically homosexual. The campaigners for gay liberation who resent any assumption that it is normal to be heterosexual. I could understand it if some readers dislike the angle from which I have approached the lives of the men discussed in this book. Biography is my favorite reading, and I prefer to read about happy and successful lives. Even when I know in advance that tragedy or sadness lie ahead, I still cling to the obviously doomed hope that all may yet be well. I dislike denigration and muckraking as much as anyone, and I do not think that I have really indulged in such practices to no good end. I agree with Dr. Pretorius, Chapter 2, page 41, that the study of the sexual inclinations of great men is particularly important when there is any suggestion of homosexuality, because of the special emotional tension and the social difficulties to which it can lead. Even today, more than 30 years after Kinsey and his co-workers revealed how great is the number of our fellow men who are troubled by such feelings. And despite the advice of the Wolfenden Committee on the need for tolerance, homosexual men complain that they suffer from unfair discrimination and have reason to fear blackmail and even violence. The remarkably convoluted Jeremy Thorpe case has shown how an imputation of homosexuality can destroy a political career. Since the First World War, my historical studies end. Understanding of the nature of homosexuality has been greatly enlarged, but there are still many people for whom the picture of a homosexual man remains one of a furtive or even an open seeker after boys and youths in order to indulge in dimly imagined orgies of lust. The existence of such individuals is proved by occasional sordid cases reported in newspapers, but there is no way in which the public can be made aware of the far greater number of men who are condemned, often self condemned by imperfect knowledge of themselves, to lead lonely lives, deprived of understanding or affection. Many repressed homosexuals lead solitary, friendless lives, which is a pity, for they have as great a capacity for friendship as anyone, and perhaps a greater need of it than most of us. Perhaps Ivan Bloch, who considered that misogynists are a separate category of men, had a point after all, for it must not be thought that all homosexual men shun the society of women, still less that they are shunned by women. Many women become very friendly with homosexual men, with whom they can often share a variety of cultural and artistic interests. They may perhaps feel relaxed and secure in the company of men for whom they know that their need expect no physical demands. Kirchner's love of flower arranging would presumably have commended him to women friends. Prince Eugene, in his comfortable old age, was plainly adored by his two elderly widows. However, Frederick, Napoleon, Nicholson, Gordon, Kitchener, and Lawrence all displayed misogynistic tendencies. I do not know if Dr. Pretorius lived through the Nazi era in Germany, but if he did, I would imagine that he saw no reason to modify his views about the value of examining the sexual inclinations of national leaders. Dick Wilson, the author of a recent biography of Mao Zedong, tells us that despite his 3 wives and 10 children, Mao was surprisingly effeminate. He giggled like a girl and had feminine traits which were noticed by several people. An American woman found that when Mao held her hand, she was repelled by the feminine. Come on. She was repelled by the feminine in him. He had no real friends and allowed no one to get close to him. I mean, he was a fucking dictator that massacred people. Mr. Wilson considers that Mao's energy was stimulated by hatred derived from a personal sense of rejection, and he comments, "It is striking that the other great lonely dictators of modern times, Napoleon, Stalin, and Hitler, all suffered from the same disadvantage." Is this thing even? Napoleon had a strange compulsion to talk about his private feelings, sometimes to rather ill-chosen confidants. Stalin, one might expect, was less inclined to such confidences than any character in history. What about Hitler? What about him? In his long, boring book, I agree, Mein Kampf, Hitler presented a picture of the kind of man he wanted the German people to believe him to be. They needed little persuasion. Much patient research has enabled such writers as Franz Jetzinger to prove that the story is, in many respects, entirely untrue. This is hardly surprising, since it has been revealed that Hitler had a great deal to hide. During the Second World War, our soldiers used to sing to the tune of Colonel Bogey, a vulgar song about the sexual equipment of the Nazi leaders. Their ribald speculations proved to be right on the ball in the case of Hitler. They were confirmed when his body was examined by Russian pathologists after his suicide and the incomplete incineration of his corpse. The left testicle could not be found either in the scrotum or on the spermatic cord inside the inguinal canal or in the small pelvis. This report is quoted in what is called an afterword by a psychiatrist, Dr. R.G.L. Waite, in The Mind of Hitler by Dr. Walter Langer, a psychoanalyst for Colonel William J. Donovan, Wild Bill, whose role was to organize and conduct psychological warfare. Dr. Langer had been in Germany and Austria during 1937 and 1938, but had not known Hitler. His task of analyzing Hitler's personality might have been made easier had he known about Hitler's monarchism, which, as Dr. Waite points out, is not an uncommon abnormality, but is very apt to lead to emotional disturbances and men thus deprived. Dr. Langer's researchers enabled him to make in the secret report to the United States Office of Strategic Services, which he completed in 1943, some accurate assessments of Hitler's possible actions and the pattern of his life. It was a lifetime of unsuccessful attempts to compensate for feelings of helplessness and inferiority. He had no use for women and was probably impotent. It was said that many of his young soldiers pitied him for the absence of women from his life. Though, as we shall see, this was not really the case. He frequently said that he would never marry, for he saw the masses as a woman to be wooed and knew that he would lose a lot of popular support if he married. His sexual life was the subject of much speculation among his associates, who thought that he was impotent, a chronic masturbator, and probably homosexual. A senior Nazi official alleged that Hitler's military record contained 2 convictions for pederasty. Hermann Rausching was said to have met 2 boys who claimed that they had been Hitler's homosexual partners. And in police records in Vienna, he was classed as a sexual pervert and an associate of homosexuals. When he was at the pinnacle of his fame, it was noticed that he took pleasure in the company of homosexual men, and his personal bodyguard were usually 100% homosexual. Ernst Röhm, an ex-army officer and one of the principal architects of the Nazi Party, once publicly proclaimed that Hitler's greatest pleasure was in looking at the behinds of peasant girls, and the plumper the better. That's Hitler's sex life. What a man, Röhm exclaimed. Hitler was present at the time and is said to have listened impassively, staring at Röhm with compressed lips. The memory of this insulting remark could have contributed to the cold, sadistic fury with which Hitler joined personally in the extermination of Ernst Röhm and his followers on the night of the Long Knives in 1934. His violent overaction to their flagrant homosexuality, some of them were in bed with boys when their slaughterers broke in, could have been a manifestation of repugnance at the homosexual component in his own nature. Something of the sort was thought to lie behind Kitchener's failure to help Sir Hector MacDonald. Dr. Langer's conclusion was that there was a very considerable feminine component in Hitler's nature and that he had probably taken part in a homosexual relationship, but had severely repressed such tendencies. But in deducing that Hitler suffered intolerable feelings of guilt that are generated by a secret and unwelcome desires, Dr. Langer was not thinking of homosexual desires. Indeed, one might even suppose that such desires were not necessarily unwelcome, nor did they need to be kept particularly secret in Nazi Germany. Hitler's dark secret was extreme sadomasochism. Millions fell victim to his sadism, of which it is unnecessary to say more. Hitler's perversion, according to Dr. Langer, was an extreme form of masochism in which the individual derives sexual gratification from having women urinate or defecate on him. It was this sort of thing which made me call a sexual profile of men in Power a nauseating book. Hitler's niece, Angelica Robel, known as Gili, revealed that during these revolting practices, Hitler insisted on being able to see everything that was going on. This poor young girl was found dead in Hitler's room, having been shot with his revolver. It is generally assumed that she had committed suicide, though some thought that she had been murdered. Otto Dietrich, Hitler's chief press officer, wrote that of the 6 women who stood in a close human relationship to him in his life, 5 died of suicide, or had attempted suicide. One of these 6 women, Renate Müller, had been dismayed when, instead of attempting the sexual intercourse which she was expecting, Hitler fell on the floor and begged her to kick him. According to Dr. Langer, Eva Braun, whom Hitler eventually married, twice attempted suicide. In the last moments of their life, she may have steeled Hitler's vacillating will to the final act before killing herself. Dr. Langer thought that there was no truth in the rumor that Hitler had suffered a genital injury during the First World War, but towards the end of that war, he was in hospital with hysterical blindness and mutism. He was said to have a morbid dread of syphilis and an unconcealed love of pornography. He clearly had the hallmarks of a neurotic personality and a most abnormal sexual life. As Dr. Langer put it, Hitler's personality had all the earmarks of a reaction formation created unconsciously as a cover up for deep lying tendencies which he despised. Here one is reminded of John Nicholson and Charles Gordon. Hitler's career, like theirs, bears the imprint of the sublimation of unacceptable urges directing their dynamic impulses into socially acceptable channels. Such a man was Adolf Hitler, and the civilized world, including, of course, most of the Germans, indeed, especially Germans, still wonders at how his peculiar magnetism contrived to enslave a great people. But many Germans who lived through the Nazi era, especially those who were young and impressionable, could certainly explain it. I could almost do so myself, having spent over 3 months in Germany and Austria between 1936 and 38. Everywhere the face of the Fuhrer, as compelling as that famous Kitchener poster of the First World War, the penetrating stare of the eyes forcing one to overlook the Charlie Chaplin mustache, surmounted a reminder that Der Deutscher Grüßt ist Heil Hitler. The young Germans with whom I went skiing were curiously more ready to mock at the absurdities of the regime than I was myself, and did not seem to resent my occasional sly digs. Some of them had ironic or cynical attitudes, rather like characters from the novels of Hans Helmut Kirst. In winter sports resorts, one saw only the restoration of the pride of a great people, the worship of physical fitness, and so on. The evil side was fatally easy to overlook. The manner in which the scales fell from my eyes need not be described here. I have confessed to my own very naive impressions of Nazi Germany, even though I actually witnessed the somewhat pastoral backwash of the Anschluss, in order to illustrate how deplorably easy it is for an evil but clever dictator to mesmerize simple people. Today, if asked to find a single good word to say for those dreadful Nazi leaders, it could only be that they adored Frederick the Great, who is one of those dissected in this book for whom I can feel an almost affectionate regard, his deep and abiding love for his sister, if for no one else, and the resolution with which he drove his emaciated and tortured body to work and work for the good of his people, compel one's sympathy and admiration. And how his soldiers loved their old Fritz, though he could not bring himself to make friends with them, or even, if he could help it, to speak their barbarous tongue. Knowing how wonderfully German soldiers can sing, one can almost hear the voices of Frederick's Prussians raised in Ein Festburg ist unser Gott, or Nun Dankit alle Gott, after a victory. They must have sounded like a Welsh rugger crowd, demanding guidance from their great Redeemer, praising the land of their fathers, or alternatively, the beloved saucepan of their mothers, if that is what Bach is all about. Of course, to the Nazis, Frederick was a national asset. His tomb in the garrison church at Potsdam, a shrine at which they held a magnificent dedicatory service in 1933. With the aged Field Marshal Hindenburg, a tottering figurehead, pathetically striving to grasp a fringe of the great king's mantle, Hitler had one portrait only in his study in the underground bunker, that of Frederick, and he deliberately copied Frederick by taking his afternoon nap uncomfortably at his desk, with his chin pressed into his chest, a blanket covering his knees. More wisely, Churchill took his in bed in the nude. Goebbels, convinced that it was the Nazi destiny to march in Frederick's footsteps, actually hailed the death of President Roosevelt as a portent, comparing it to the death of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, after which her son Joseph reversed Austria's policy of hostility to Frederick. But by then, the deluded Hitler and Goebbels, approaching their end, were living largely in a world of fantasy. It must be obvious that for me, Napoleon, the most fascinating of them all, is the villain of this book, partly because he was the forerunner of our modern dictators, Stalin, Hitler, and Mussolini, a tin pot Caesar whose overblown ambition to be included among the great ones was expressed in a particularly nauseating admission. He remarked to Badoglio, I need only a few thousand dead to ensure that I have the right to sit at the peace table in the capacity of a co-belligerent. This echo of Napoleon's terrible self-revelation, I can afford to expend 100,000 men a year, earns the Italian bullfrog a very black mark. Humane have their own reactions to these foul pronouncements, which I have been unable to resist quoting in previous books. My own reaction has always been on the lines of this sentence from a soldier to his general in Hans Helmut Kurst's The Night of the Generals, page 312. Anyone who sees fit to burn human beings like coal is not a human being himself. Of course, Napoleon was not always a villain to me, any more than he has been to tens of thousands of Napoleonolators, a hideous though expressive word used in the late 19th century. Napoleonolators. Oh, what the fuck? As for the two other bad men of this study of homosexuality and sublimation, Herbert Kitchener and John Nicholson, the former, could not fail to be a hero to a 10-year-old schoolboy in 1914, and I am quite sure that if I had been a young subaltern in 1857, I would have idolized John Nicholson. Among the more admirable characters, Alexander of Macedon, an exciting and in many ways a lovable hero, is too far distant in time to permit of any very personal feelings. When reading about him, we are apt to be dazzled by sparks flying from the grinding of personal axes. As a doctor, I may be allowed to award him a bad mark for his treatment of Glaucius, the physician, although I have found Prince Eugene of Savoy and King Charles II of Sweden rather mysterious personalities. They are of undeniably heroic stature. In that autobiographical memoir was really written by, if that autobiographical memoir was really written by Eugene, as I hope it would consolidate his place in our affection, so nobly earned by his unfailing, unselfish support of the great Duke of Marlborough. Charles Gordon's unnecessarily heroic death made him a martyr in the eyes of most of his fellow countrymen, the archetypal victim of governmental bumbling and ineptitude. Unfair to the government of the day, no doubt, but he himself helped to create that impression. The last words in his journal are, I have done my best for the honor of my country. Goodbye. Although, like John Nicholson, he sometimes conveyed an impression of being self-assured and chosen by God, he was really far removed from self-satisfaction. The National Library of Scotland has many letters written by Gordon to William Mackinnon, later Sir William, the founder of the British India Steam Navigation Company. Many bees from Gordon's bonnet buzz contentedly in these letters, for Sir William was able to help him in many of his strange projects, but self-revelation is there too. On 12th February 1880, Gordon wrote, You value me far, far too highly. My only merits are that I try to do my best and I do not flinch from anything I set my hand to. But I am not wise or discreet, and thank God I know it. That a man so greatly admired should have been so unhappy is doubly sad. if one believes that today such a man can almost certainly be helped to make a better adjustment to life. The evidence that T. Lawrence needed such help is even stronger. On what lines might such men in particular, or men in general, be advised? Karen Horney puts it all very well. First of all, it should be taught that the only real satisfactory way for the sexual instinct to find expression is in a heterosexual love relationship. To that one might add that it is cemented by the birth of children that will be the ultimate reward and happiness, fulfilling what the whole apparatus of sexual feeling was given to us for. Mrs. Horney finds that the realization that deviant impulses are universal and is a valuable beginning to treatment. Patients are apt to have a deep sense of guilt and to be unable to believe that anyone who knew that they had such feelings could ever come to accept or love them. They must learn to accept and come to terms with their deviant impulses. This is an arresting thought, and one which disposes of the objections of those who fear that speaking or writing about deviations might tend to encourage young people to experiment with them. Openness should do more good than harm. I am reminded of the sense of relief felt by the young transvestite soldier when he realized that he was not the only pebble on his particular beach, and also of the common sense of some wives who have discovered their husbands' transvestist practices and quietly come to terms with them. It is at least possible that feelings of inferiority, that most common evil of our time, see chapter 5, page 91, might be alleviated by more general knowledge about all aspects of sexuality. Originating when the small, weak child is completely dependent on great, powerful adults, they are gradually forgotten by the luckier individuals. In the less fortunate, they may be fed to misunderstanding and faulty evaluation of themselves and grow into a barrier across the path to the unconscious goal of superiority. As Adler called it, the universal desire to be respected, admired, loved. Adler could be called the father of the almost too popular inferiority complex. Though he himself never used that term, he explained how it grew out of his concept of organ inferiority, to which I have already referred. Any real or even fancied physical defect, even quite unimportant ones such as small stature or short sightedness, may be seized upon and encourage the growth of feelings of inferiority. The individual forms an unreal image of himself, and if a man may feel that he is not as virile or attractive as other men, ideas of this sort are encouraged, especially perhaps in women, by television advertisers playing upon various aspects of sexual attractiveness, which can, of course, be enhanced by use of their products. Men, and for all I know, women as well, who fall victim to such self doubts may, through fear of a rebuff and injury to their pride, veer towards homosexuality. Comparing oneself with others, often to one's own disadvantage, is a common cause of unhappiness. If it leads to self improvement, it may be no bad thing, but often it gets out of hand. In extreme forms, there may be self hate and wallowing in guilt, feelings, even longing for death. It has been said that the longing to surrender to something bigger than oneself is an essential element in most forms of religion. In the case of Christianity, some men and even more women who abandon hopes of sexual fulfillment dedicate their lives to Christ. Charles Gordon sounds very like a case of this sort. Frederick the Great, Napoleon, T. Lawrence, and Hitler were probably victims of organ inferiority in its most damaging form, that of doubts about the adequacy of sexual apparatus. Two of them, Napoleon and Lawrence, and quite possibly also Alexander the Great, had the added disadvantage of being rather small in stature. Graham Heath, chapter 2, page 33, suggested that today's greater openness, even permissiveness about sex, could tend to cancel the useful influence of sublimation. Would the world thus lose much that is worthwhile? Probably not. The kind of man studied in this book brings war and conquest, but the influence of sublimation has been discerned much more in the world of art, especially the stage. It would be tactless to probe the sexual orientation of men and women who are alive or recently dead. In music, a vast contribution to the sum of human happiness has been made by composers who were sexually well adjusted. A noted exception is Tchaikovsky, whose poignant song, None But the Lonely Heart, could be the theme song of those who have been unable to organize their lives on companionable lines. But he is overwhelmed by a great army of normal composers from Alessandro Scarlatti to Antonin Dvorak. The prodigious musical output of J.S. Bach was matched by the fathering of 20 children and 2 marriages. What? He had 20 kids? Damn. The irritation of a cantankerous, nagging wife did not ruffle the pellucid stream of Haydn's music, just as worries about money and his wife's ill health are not reflected in our great treasure, the wonderfully varied music of the divine Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. It has been said that Constance Weber was not the ideal wife for Mozart, and his description of her in a letter to his father was less than glowing. He had earlier loved one of her sisters, but perhaps Constance, with whom he got along well enough, helped to balance a slightly naive, unworldly quality in his character. They had 6 children in their short married life, the recent regrettable tendency to assume that if a man remains unmarried, his sexual inclinations demand examination led a recent biographer of Beethoven to invite a doctor to contribute a study of his medical and psychological record. Thank goodness it was ruled that the great man was not homosexual. Reasons enough existed to obstruct his plans for marriage, but the immortal beloved existed. Indeed, there were at least 7 candidates for that honor. A friend, when asked if the great composer had ever been in love, replied that he was hardly ever out of it. Brahms' long relationship with Clara Schumann was described as a passionate friendship, and a contemporary described the old bachelor as immer lieb und lustig, perhaps the most interesting of those glorious men from the point of view of my study is Franz Schubert. Although the Schubert of the Schubertiads sound that most companionable of men, a recent biographer John Reed wrote in 1972 that he had a shy, introverted nature, was painfully modest, and firmly convinced that no woman could love him. One might deduce that he was another one of those with a sense of organ inferiority, with his short sightedness and rather unprepossessing appearance, which disappointed some admirers when they met him. A portly, plain, nearsighted little man, 5 feet and a half inch. Gratitude for the phenomenal music outpouring of his short life must make us sad that his love affairs brought him sadness. Dr. Walter Longer in 1973, commenting upon the secret report about Hitler, which he had submitted 30 years earlier, expressed the belief that if such a study had been made years earlier, the course of history might have changed. He suggested that Stalin and Castro were suitable subjects for such studies, which might help to avert serious blunders in dealing with national leaders. It would be comforting to think that he could be right, for dictators steadily become nastier and more destructive. Napoleon threatened that if he were brought down, he would bury Europe beneath the ruins of his throne. Hitler said much the same and did much more about it. As we advanced through Germany, some expert in public relations with pardonable malice caused to be erected in towns in which no pathways could be discerned in the horrible mountains of rubble, large notices bearing in English and German a quotation from the Führer's speeches. Give me 5 years and you will not recognize Germany. Gebt mir 5 Jahre und ich werde Deutschland nie wieder Vitor Kennan, Dr. Pretorius, Dr. Longer, and now myself may be naive in hoping that a widespread understanding of the psychological pressures which bear upon men who are imperfectly adjusted to claims of male sexuality might help to prevent the insidious growth of new Hitlers. If only the whole world could feel the power of harmony, was the hope of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. The pervasive influence of radio and television is doing all it can to fulfill that uniquely wonderful human being's dream. The same media are also doing their best to inculcate in the minds of young people, admittedly by methods which may not be uniformly acceptable, a balanced understanding of human sexuality. Perhaps it is too much to hope that such efforts and the increasing openness with which young people can speak of and indeed practice relationships between the sexes might help to avert the secret growth of megalomaniac tendencies in some frustrated human being. Some embryonic dictator, but surely an equally worthy aim is to prevent unnecessary happiness and loneliness arising from imperfect understanding of this demanding side of our natures. In this aim, a useful role could be played by some of the books to which I have drawn attention, and even, I hope, by this book of mine. Mine. All right. I guess I'll show the appendix. If anyone is, you'll have to pause and look because I'm not going to read the appendix. I've already forgotten half the book, so. Oh, there's a second appendix. Great. And an index in case you really want to delve into this book. It's all Rob's. Thank God this book's done.